I want to tell you about a man I once heard about. He worked 32 years at the same company. Showed up every morning. Never missed a day. Raised 2 kids. Paid his mortgage on time. Never carried a credit card balance past 30 days. By every measure that society uses to define a responsible person, he was it. He retired at 67 with about $200,000 in savings. His pension was modest. Social Security covered the basics. And on the day he walked out of that office for the last time, someone asked him what he was going to do with all his free time. He said, "I'm going to be careful." That word stayed with me. Careful. Because here's what struck me. This man had been careful his entire life. He had avoided debt like it was a disease. He had never borrowed money for anything other than his house and 1 car. He had done everything right by the rules he was given. And at 67, after 32 years of careful, disciplined, responsible living, he had just enough to survive. Not thrive. Survive. Meanwhile, across town, a man who had borrowed strategically, who had used debt as a tool rather than a trap, was sitting on a portfolio worth several $1,000,000. He hadn't worked harder. He hadn't been luckier, not in any meaningful sense. He had simply understood something about money that most people are never taught. And that's what I want to talk to you about today, because there is a conversation happening in this country, in boardrooms, at dinner tables in wealthy neighborhoods, in the quiet strategy sessions of people who are quietly building generational wealth. And you are probably not part of it. Not because you aren't smart enough, not because you don't work hard enough, but because nobody ever sat down with you and explained how money actually moves in this world, how the people at the top actually think about debt, what they know that you don't. That gap, that silence, is what this is about. Let's start with a truth that is going to feel uncomfortable. Most of us were taught that debt is bad. Period. End of discussion. Borrow money. Pay it back as fast as you can. And if you're really disciplined, don't borrow at all. Dave Ramsey has built an empire on this idea. Your grandmother probably lived by it. And in many contexts, they're not entirely wrong. Consumer debt, high interest credit cards, payday loans, those are genuinely destructive. We'll get to that distinction in a moment. But somewhere along the way, we made a critical error. We took the lesson that bad debt is dangerous and turned it into the belief that all debt is shameful. And that belief, that quiet, deeply embedded belief, is costing ordinary Americans their financial futures every single day. Here's what you need to understand. Debt is not inherently good or bad. It is a tool. And like any tool, what matters is how you use it and in whose hands it sits. A hammer can build a house. A hammer can also break a window. The hammer doesn't care. It just does what you do with it. The wealthy understand this. They have understood it for a long time. And the reason they don't talk about it loudly is partly because there's no incentive to share, and partly because the system, as it currently exists, works extremely well for people who understand how leverage functions, and extremely poorly for people who don't. So let me try to explain it the way I wish someone had explained it to me a long time ago. When you borrow money at a low interest rate and use it to acquire an asset that generates a return higher than that interest rate, you have done something remarkable. You have used someone else's money to make yourself wealthier. The bank takes on some of the risk of lending. You capture the upside. Over time, if the asset appreciates, and historically, well, chosen assets do, you have built wealth that would have taken you decades to build using only your own savings. This is not a trick. This is not a loophole. This is arithmetic. And it has been understood by every major wealth builder in American history. Think about real estate for a moment. You find a property worth $500,000. You put $100,000 down, money you've saved, and you borrow $400,000 at a reasonable interest rate. Now, the property generates rental income. That income pays the mortgage. It pays the taxes, the insurance, the maintenance. And at the end of the year, perhaps you have a few $1,000s of positive cash flow, maybe more, maybe less, depending on the market. But here's what most people miss entirely. The tenant is paying down your mortgage every single month. They are building your equity for you. And if the property appreciates in value over time, let's say it's worth $600,000 5 years later, you haven't made $100,000 on your investment. You've made $100,000 on a $100,000 investment. That's 100% return. In 5 years, could you have bought that property for cash? Maybe if you had $500,000 sitting around. But then you'd have put all your capital into one asset. You'd have no diversification. You'd have no liquidity. And any emergency, a bad tenant, a leaking roof, a medical bill, could unravel the whole thing. Instead, by using leverage thoughtfully, by borrowing at a rate lower than the asset's expected return, you have made your capital work 4 or 5 times harder than it would have otherwise. You have, in the language of finance, amplified your return. Now, I need to stop here and say something very clearly, because I've seen what happens when people hear this concept and sprint toward the nearest bank without thinking it through. Leverage amplifies gains, but it also amplifies losses. If that property drops in value, if the rental market collapses, if a major employer leaves the area, if you misjudge the neighborhood, you still owe $400,000. The bank is not sympathetic to market conditions. The debt is real whether the asset performs or not. This is why the wealthy don't just use debt. They use debt carefully. They study the asset. They stress test the numbers. They ask what happens if things go wrong, not just what happens if things go right. They maintain cash reserves. They don't borrow to the edge of what the bank will approve. They borrow to the level their own analysis says is sustainable. That distinction between using debt as a tool and being used by debt as a trap is everything. Let me give you another example, because this one touches something most of us have direct access to, but rarely think about strategically. Imagine you're 40 years old. You have $100,000 sitting in a savings account. The bank is paying you 1.5% interest on it. You're proud of that money. It represents years of discipline. You sleep better knowing it's there. Now someone tells you about a business opportunity, a small franchise, a proven model. The numbers suggest you can generate 20 to 25% annually on that investment if you run it reasonably well. You could borrow $60,000 at 6% to supplement your own capital, reduce the personal risk, and keep $40,000 in reserve for emergencies and operations. Most ordinary people will hesitate at the word borrow. The instinct, the conditioned instinct, is to wait, save more. Don't take on debt. Be careful. So they wait. 5 years pass. The savings account has grown to $107,000. And the franchise, which someone else opened, has generated the owner a comfortable income and a business worth 3 times what they paid for it. The person who waited didn't lose money. That's true. They were careful. But careful, in this case, was its own kind of failure. Because the opportunity cost of not acting, of not using leverage intelligently, was enormous. This is one of the quieter tragedies of financial life. It doesn't show up on any statement. It doesn't register as a loss. but it's real, and it compounds just like everything else in finance. Now let's talk about the thing that's sitting in most of your lives right now, and the thing that wealthy people think about very differently than most people do: your home. In this country, we are taught that paying off your mortgage is a financial victory. Burn the mortgage. Host a party. Feel the freedom. And yes, there is real psychological value in owning your home outright. I would never dismiss that. But here is what sophisticated investors understand about a paid-off house. That equity, the money you've built up in your home, is doing nothing. It is trapped. It is illiquid. It is not working for you. It is simply sitting there, and the only way to access it is to borrow against it or sell it. Meanwhile, if you had taken that same equity and deployed it into income, producing assets, even conservatively, it could be generating returns that compound over time. The wealthy don't just pay down debt on appreciating assets. They manage it. They think about what the cost of the debt is, what the return on alternative uses of that capital would be, and they make decisions based on that analysis. I'm not saying go refinance your house and put it all in the stock market. That is exactly the kind of reckless thinking I want to steer you away from. But I am saying, start thinking like a business person about your balance sheet. Every dollar you have is either working for you or it isn't. Every dollar of equity you hold in an illiquid asset has an opportunity cost. These are not exotic concepts. They are basic, foundational ways of thinking about money that the wealthy internalize early, and that most ordinary people never encounter at all. Let me tell you about a different kind of debt now, because we've been talking about what I'd call strategic debt, borrowing to acquire assets that can generate returns. But there is another kind of debt in this country that is absolutely destroying people, and it looks exactly the same on the surface. It's consumer debt, credit card debt, auto loans on vehicles that are depreciating the moment you drive off the lot. Buy now, pay later schemes for things you didn't need and won't value in 6 months. This is not leverage. This is consumption on credit. And it is the single most effective mechanism for transferring wealth from ordinary people to financial institutions. The average American carries several $1,000s in credit card debt at an interest rate of somewhere between 18 and 24%. Think about that number for a moment. 18 to 24%. The stock market over long periods has historically returned somewhere around 8 to 10% annually. So if you are carrying credit card debt, you are paying more in interest than most investments can return. Before you invest a single dollar, before you open a brokerage account, before you get excited about any opportunity, you need to eliminate high-interest consumer debt. That is not optional. That is the foundation. This is where the debt is a tool. Lesson gets misread. People hear that wealthy people use debt, and they think, well, I should use debt too. And then they borrow for things that have no return. A vacation, a new television, a car upgrade they can't really afford. That is not strategy. That is what the credit card company wants you to think strategy looks like. The difference is simple. Does the debt you're taking on create something that generates more than it costs? If yes, it can be useful. If no, it is a drain. Period. Now I want to talk to you about something that doesn't get discussed enough in conversations about wealth, and it has nothing to do with interest rates or asset classes. It has to do with how we think, how we feel, how deeply our emotions drive financial decisions that we believe are rational. There was a period, not so long ago, when markets fell sharply. Not a small dip, a genuine stomach-dropping headline screaming decline that made people feel like the world was ending financially. I watched people, smart people, disciplined people, sell everything, get out, move to cash, because the pain of watching their portfolios decline was more than they could bear. And I understand that feeling. It is powerful. It feels like self-protection. It feels like the responsible thing to do. Get out before it gets worse. But here's what almost always happens next. The market recovers. Not immediately, not painlessly, but eventually. It has historically every single time. And the people who sold in panic, who locked in their losses because the discomfort was too great, missed the recovery. They had to decide when to get back in. And they almost always waited too long, getting back in near the top, just in time for the next dip. Meanwhile, the people who did nothing, who stayed invested, who understood that short-term pain is the price you pay for long-term gain, came through the other side with their wealth intact and often meaningfully larger. This is one of the most important financial skills you can develop. Not stock picking ability, not timing the market. The ability to tolerate discomfort. The ability to feel the fear and not act on it. To separate what your nervous system is telling you from what the data actually suggests. Your nervous system was designed for a world where threats were immediate. A predator, a rival, a drought. Your brain does not naturally distinguish between the threat of a lion and the threat of a portfolio decline. Both trigger the same response, do something, right now, to make the discomfort stop. But in investing, the right move is often to do nothing. And that is one of the hardest things a human being can do. The wealthy have figured this out. Not because they're emotionally superior, they feel fear too, but because they have been through enough cycles to know that the panic passes. Because their advisors, their frameworks, their discipline, all of it is designed to protect them from their own worst instincts in the moments when those instincts are loudest. What can you do? You can build a plan, a clear, written, specific plan before the storm hits. You can decide in advance how you'll respond to a 30% decline, because if you wait until it's happening to decide, the answer will almost always be wrong. You can build a financial life that is resilient enough that a bad year doesn't force you to sell. Because the people who get hurt most in downturns are often the ones who were over-leveraged, under-reserved, and forced to sell at the worst possible moment. Preparation is not exciting. It doesn't make for good conversation at a dinner party, but it is the difference between the person who builds wealth over decades and the person who keeps almost getting there. We're getting close to the end of this, and I want to leave you with something practical. Not a tips list, not 5 steps to financial freedom. Just a few real mindset shifts that, if you genuinely internalize them, will change how you make decisions. The first is this: start thinking about your net worth, not your income. Income matters, but wealthy people are obsessed with what they own minus what they owe. They are building a balance sheet. They are thinking about assets. Every financial decision they make is measured against the question, does this increase my net worth over time, or does it decrease it? A raise that gets spent doesn't improve your net worth. An investment that grows quietly does. Your job is to grow what you own and shrink what you owe, and to do it with patience. The second is to understand the difference between performing wealthy and being wealthy. There are millions of Americans who look wealthy. Nice cars, nice vacations, nice watches, and they are one bad month away from real trouble. Their income is high and their net worth is thin. Then there are people who look perfectly ordinary. Modest house, sensible car, nothing flashy, and they have built something extraordinary over 20 or 30 years. The gap between those two lives is almost entirely discipline. The discipline to delay gratification, to invest before you spend, to let time and compounding do the heavy lifting while everyone around you is busy performing. The third is that time is the variable most people underestimate. People want results quickly. They want the strategy that works in 2 years. And I understand life is expensive, time feels short, and the pressure is real. But the mathematics of compounding are breathtaking over long periods and modest over short ones. A person who starts investing consistently at 25 and never stops has a fundamentally different financial life at 65 than someone who started at 45, even if the late starter invests more aggressively. The years matter more than almost any other variable. More than which stock you pick. More than which fund has the lowest fees. More than almost anything, start earlier than you think you need to, and never stop. And finally, and this is perhaps the most important thing I can say, stop waiting until you understand everything before you act. The complexity of finance can feel paralyzing. There is always more to learn. The people who build wealth are not the ones who understand every instrument, every tax strategy, every macroeconomic variable. They are the ones who understand enough to begin and who begin. They make mistakes, they learn, they adjust, and they keep going. Paralysis disguised as prudence is still paralysis. You do not need to be a financial expert to build a stable, dignified financial life. You need to spend less than you earn, invest the difference consistently into assets that grow over time, use debt only when it creates more than it costs, protect yourself from your own panic in moments of market stress, and give the whole thing enough time to compound. That's it. That is the whole architecture. It is simple in concept and difficult in execution. Not because the concepts are hard, but because they require you to act against some very deeply wired human instincts, the desire for immediate gratification, the desire to flee from fear, the desire to spend when you feel successful and freeze when you feel afraid. The man I told you about at the beginning of this, the one who retired with $200,000 after 32 years of careful living, he wasn't foolish. He wasn't lazy. He was taught the wrong things by people who were themselves taught the wrong things. He avoided debt because he was told debt was dangerous. He kept money in savings because he was told that was safe. He never thought much about assets or leverage or compounding because nobody in his life ever introduced him to those ideas as real tools available to ordinary people. This is not his fault. It is, in a very real way, the fault of a financial education system in this country that is almost entirely absent. That teaches children to balance a checkbook, but not to build a portfolio. That warns about credit card interest, but never explains why a mortgage on an appreciating asset in a growing city is a completely different animal. You can't go back. Neither can he. But you can decide, starting today, that you are going to think differently, that you are going to understand the distinction between good debt and bad debt, that you are going to build a balance sheet, not just a budget, that you are going to be patient enough to let time do what time does, which is turn consistent, disciplined action into something genuinely extraordinary. The wealthiest people in this country are not smarter than you. They do not have access to secret information you'll never find. They are not working 20 hours a day while you sleep. Many of them are doing far less visible work than you are. What they have cultivated over years is a different relationship with money, a different way of thinking about it, a framework that treats capital as something to be deployed wisely, not simply preserved fearfully. You can build that framework. It takes time. It takes honesty, particularly about the financial habits and beliefs you carry that are not serving you. It takes the willingness to be uncomfortable, to invest when the news is frightening, to wait when your neighbor is bragging about his latest purchase, to let the boring, consistent approach work its quiet, invisible magic over years and decades. But it works. The mathematics work. The psychology, once you understand it, can be managed. And the outcome? Genuine financial stability, the ability to weather storms, the freedom to make choices from a position of strength rather than desperation. That outcome is available to more people and are currently reaching for it. Start there. Just start. And then don't stop. That's the whole thing.